Hey, everybody. On behalf of everyone here at the Center for Brain Health, welcome to the Frontiers of Brain Health, where we take a deep dive into the most exciting new developments in brain research. My name is Bart Ritma. I'm a professor of cognitive neuroscience here at University of Texas at Dallas and the director of the Salmon's Brain Health Imaging Center at UT Dallas. We'll be getting to our speaker in just a couple minutes, but we'll have a few minutes at the end to answer some questions. So for the virtual audience, please use the Q&A function. For those of you in person, have your questions ready to ask. We'll get to as many of them as we can at the end. This presentation is also recorded. For those of you who don't know much about us, the Center for Brain Health is a cognitive neuroscience research center at the University of Texas at Dallas. We have dedicated the past 3 decades to exploring neuroplasticity and the brain's amazing lifelong potential to get stronger and work better. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dan Krawczyk, who got his bachelor's degree from SUNY Fredonia, that's State University of New York. He got his degree in psychology and then went on to doctoral training at University of California, Los Angeles, where he got his doctorate in cognitive neuroscience. He came to UTD in 2006 along with me, and we've been abiding colleagues ever since. He ascended to full professorship in 2018. I'm told that he's a good father and also an excellent pinball player, and he collects pinball machines, actually, which I'm quite envious of. He currently holds the Debbie and Jim Francis Chair in the School of Behavioral and Brain Sciences. He's the Deputy Director of the Research Center, of Research at the Center for Brain Health, and he explores how brain science influences everyday behaviors. Over the past 20 years, he's researched how to improve reasoning and decision-making, and he works as an author, podcaster, and, as I mentioned, professor of psychology and neuroscience. Dan has held multiple federally funded research studies to evaluate thinking and cognitive performance. His lab uses a diversity of research methods, including behavioral studies, machine learning, brain imaging, and brain stimulation. His work is focused on reasoning by analogy, decision framing, and cognitive improvement. Writing books alongside peer-reviewed scientific articles. Dan is the author of one book called Reasoning, the Neuroscience of How We Think, a comprehensive 13-chapter interdisciplinary guide to how people make decisions. So if you're interested in decision-making, that's the book to get. And another book called Understanding Behavioral Bias, and the S is with a $sign. Guide to Improving Financial Decision-Making. So if you're interested in reasoning and decision-making, get that book. This book reflects an intensively multidisciplinary research process, along with his other work, applying evidence from neuroscience, psychology, development, economics, biology, and technology. Dan continues to share his passion for scientific inquiry with a larger audience through speaking, writing, and science, and a podcast called Mental Models with over 70 episodes recorded so far. His current interests include finance, art, health, medicine, human expert performance, and of course, pinball. So with no further ado, let me give you Dan Krawczyk.
Thank you. What an intro, Bart. I'm going to hire you as my PR agent. That was amazing. Okay, thank you all for being here. And I wanted to get us rolling first by a thank you to Christy Miranda, who is one of the major reasons that we're here enjoying this talk series, which has been really successful over the last 8 years. So she's worked with me to deal with logistics and travel and scheduling and getting everyone to get in their seats on time. and we made it through COVID where we were all virtual, and we made it back to where we're all in person and virtual as well. So welcome to the virtual audience too. So I just wanted to thank Christy for her efforts on this. Round of applause, absolutely. And she is rotating off from this duty, so Bonnie Robinson will be picking up right where she left off with running Frontiers. All right, so in this talk, we're going to be focusing on a topic that is meaningful to all of us, and that is values, the psychology of values. Sorry. And to get us rolling, I'd like to just to think through what are 3 of your most cherished values. You don't have to raise a hand. Just think to yourself, what are those things you aspire to? They might be things you do on a daily basis, or they might merely be something you reflect on periodically throughout the years. Let's think about a related question, no less deep. What is your purpose in life? This could be something that drives you forward. It's one of those organizational principles for how we want to live our life. And then last question, in your own words, what makes a good life? Could project many years into the future. Maybe after you're gone, what would you want a loved one to have said about you, or just as a loved one or a close friend reflects on what you were about and how you lived your life? You know, what are some descriptions that come to mind when you think about that? And these are questions that all come down to values. Values can transcend any given circumstance, but they can also be informed by our current context and environment. And I think this is an excellent definition from Sagiv and Schwartz from 2022, an academic definition that I think says a lot about our daily lives. These are cognitive representations of basic motivations, and they are goals to be pursued. And I've highlighted that idea that we're talking about goals in life. This doesn't necessarily mean something you've already accomplished. That is your values. Living your values is an ongoing project out into the future. And Schwartz has pointed out it can also be something you're aspiring to. So moving in the direction of living in accordance with a particular value is something we might do. I had asked you to reflect on your 3 top values, your most cherished values. This is a word cloud showing a lot of the common answers that one would find. Things like integrity, respect can be quite central, honesty, compassion. Just by quick show of hands, did any of these top 3 or 4 values come to the forefront of your mind? Wow, that is really impressive. So we do have things in common when it comes to this space of values. And as I progress in this talk, I want us to reflect on the type of brain that we have. We are hunter-gatherers that would have lived in tribes for thousands of years prior to having smartphones and iPads and devices. Our world is not about clicking and subscribing and liking. Rather, it's about getting together on a landscape, sometimes a hostile landscape, and benefiting from group behavior. This is a really central element as to how our minds developed. We are a social primate, and these values don't just guide us personally. Most of the values have something to do with other people and benefiting from the group, surviving through difficult conditions of famine, disease, possibly weather events. That's the kind of brain that we carry with us through life. I want to ask a very broad question right now, and then we'll move to the more specific individual values and ultimately the brain and values. At the broadest level, zooming way out, what do different cultures value? And this is a really important question. It has to do with international affairs. It has to do with international conflict. It has to do with negotiations and agreements and allies and warfare. It is almost everything we care about comes down to these cultural values. And I wanted to point out the excellent work of the World Values Survey. Ronald Engelhardt and his colleagues have done this work for going on 40 plus years, and they're analyzing people's values, beliefs, and norms in a comparative cross-national way, and they're collecting data every 5 years in waves. They're up to 8 waves around the world in 120 countries, sampling from over 94% of the world's population. That is amazing work, and there are many, many scholars involved with this effort in analyzing a great deal of it. I'm just going to point out one of the most broad general results that has come out of the World Values Survey, which I think is very informative. Values across cultures organize across 2 different dimensions. The first being survival values versus self-expression values. The survival values are those that would get us home safely on the savannah as a hunter-gatherer, the things that are very basic like healthcare and food and anything to do with living in a group and maintaining our health, maintaining just a basic lifestyle. That can be what cultures are about in many instances. Otherwise, if those needs are met, kind of in like a Maslow's hierarchy type way, you can go up to other values which maybe have more to do with independence, self-expression, your own ideas, maybe a government that can create policies that are for most of the people most of the time. That is one of the axes. The other are traditional values versus the secular values. And traditional values would be historically inherited wisdom of the ages, following what your ancestors had done. That's often about conformity. It's often about adhering to a religious belief and falling in line with a national style or a cultural style that doesn't have a lot of variation. On the other hand, the secular is what we see in a lot of first world nations where it's more about let's maybe take some things from the past but add current things and think through our own ways. And so these plot very interestingly on this Engelhardt-Wetzel World Cultural Map, and this is from 2023, so recent data. And what you're seeing is as you move up the y-axis, you're moving towards secular values. As you go down the y-axis, it's traditional values. And survival is over on the x-axis on that left of the graph. And then as we move right, we move into self-expression. Now, this is hard to see on this slide, but Protestant Europe occupies this region at the very high secular and at the very high self-expression. And African Islamic nations tend to be more traditional and more survival-based. And you might wonder where the United States falls. It is basically right in here. So we are oriented more toward self-expression, but we're not as self-expression oriented as countries such as Sweden or Denmark. Where do we fall on tradition versus secular values? Right smack in the middle. We have to live with the tension of having traditional values and many of them, right? So you can have heartfelt disagreements among different traditions that collide in the United States, and those will collide and brush up and cause friction with the secular values. So that explains a lot of who we are as a nation and as a people. We're constantly in flux and constantly pivoting from traditional to secular. And this is a really interesting map too, because you'll notice that Catholic Europe has a position in the middle, but it does weird convolutions where some of the cultures sort of don't fit exactly right, and West and South Asia kind of intermixes. So regional development doesn't fully explain this. There are unique cultures that have kind of grown up in different ways. But I think it's very interesting that these organize around this traditional versus the secular, and this survival versus this more independent self-expression type value. Cultural values change. So this is a map that is beginning in the early 1980s, and it's going to go through 2015. So let's go ahead and watch the movement. Just look at the points in the direction they move over the years. We're in the 1980s, we move into the 1990s. Look at those different cultures moving up and down the different axes or across. And what you'll observe as we get into the 2000s is a lot of cultural change. Look at all that movement in 2008, 2009, and into the present day. You also notice we're not all moving in the same direction. Nations move in different directions over time, leading us to this eventual map that we see in present times. So we live in times of change, and cultural values vary, so there's some plasticity. What we don't see is Sweden zooming back to a survivalist style or toward a traditional orientation. It could. Circumstances could be imposed that might alter the values landscape. But this is most people most of the time in different cultures. And I think it does say something about the disagreements as well as the opportunities for harmony and agreement. We can often bond over these shared values or learn from one another based on separate values. I'd like to pivot to what cultures actually share. So how do we go forward in the world and in society? And it turns out there is some amazing work by Shalom Schwartz. Now, you don't get very far in the values literature before coming across the name Shalom Schwartz. He is one of my academic heroes. I did let him know that this talk was going on. Hello, Shalom, and thank you for all the work you've done. This is a career spent on human values, and Schwartz and his colleagues identified 10 of them. And this is worldwide research in over 90 cultures, 500 plus samples. Look at the citation count of Shalom Schwartz, 171,500 citations. That's not nearly enough. This work is so important. I think his impact will continue to rise and rise because he really devoted himself to something so important in our understanding of life. You know, what is it that we can all share as human values? I was fortunate enough to see Shalom Schwartz receive a Career Achievement Award at the Social and Personality meeting, and I was thrilled about it. I was like a Schwartz fan, yes, Shalom. And he was so gracious, and I got to meet him and hear about his biography. Really, really inspiring scholar. The work we do on values is definitely standing on the shoulders of giants from Schwartz and his colleagues. So the procedure of Schwartz would be to do survey research. This is going to be questionnaires done around the world, and they're questions that get at how much do you agree with a particular situation, and that translates into a particular value. And I mentioned there are 10 of them. They're organized in what Schwartz calls the circumplex of values, which is this pie chart. Now, wedges of the different values, and I'll cover what those are in a moment, wedges that neighbor one another are highly intercorrelated. Something like tradition and conformity up in that right side. They're so intercorrelated, they often are represented in the same wedge. Meanwhile, if you pivot across the axis and go toward this openness to change, those tend to be inversely correlated. So something like self-direction and security tend to trade off. If you're highly secure, you're probably giving up independent self-direction. And if you're all about exploration and self-direction, you're going to sacrifice your security along the way. So the circumplex of the 10 values organizes into this circular format that has correlations. These aren't put in randomly. There are correlations or inverse correlations that suggest something important about the way our minds work. So let's consider what these are. What are these 10 values? If we look at the right side of the graph, we have the conservation values. This is important when you're in times that require you to survive. These are very much survival values. Tradition and conformity are about following rules. Tradition is about respecting what came before, and conformity is basically fitting in, not making waves. I think conformity expresses in our culture with just looking the part, basically fitting norms. It's just an important set of values. That's highly interrelated with security. Now, security values are all about your own personal security as well as the security of your loved ones and family as well. It's about safety and stability. And this is indeed a really important point for developmental psychology. So children have healthy attachment, right? Secure attachment is a big predictor of mental health and success throughout life. So very core, obvious, basic value there. And if we pivot across the circumplex to the openness to change values, here we're talking about self-direction, thinking, creating, acting independently. We're talking about stimulation, which is exploring new things and leading an exciting life. And we're talking about hedonism. Hedonism has a negative connotation in our culture, but for Schwartz's basic values, hedonism is about enjoying the good things in life. It can be appreciating a conversation with a friend or having a nice glass of wine or viewing a sunset. That's a hedonism we can all get behind. Notice those are about times where perhaps our tribe has gotten too large. We're exploiting the environment too much. We need to break off. Groups need to fracture. Or perhaps some environmental change has introduced this idea, and we need to now explore. Notice again, this resonates in developmental psychology. Infants start exploring, and you can't stop them. And they seek stimulation, and they seek excitement, and we try to curb that some of the time for their security. So there's that natural trade-off and balance between the two. And if we look at the other sectors of this chart, we can think about self-enhancement. These are values of power and achievement. And we can all get behind that as well. We want to achieve things in life, and activities that lead to our success would count in that wedge. And power would be seeking social status. Any sort of hierarchical situation, as you would observe in a human tribe, is about power. It can be influence over resources, or influence over other people. That's all about you, the self-enhancement sector of the Schwartz values. And then if we pivot up to the very top, the self-transcendence values of universalism and benevolence. Now, benevolence is going to be doing good for your neighbors, helping those closest to you along the journey, and helping friends. I think that is just a very obvious universal value. And it's highly interrelated with something called universalism, which is also about helping other people, but it's more of a community base. So helping the welfare of a whole community, protecting our environment, could be protecting our business environment or systems that work well for our group living is all about universalism. So these are the values that appear around the world. And in Schwartz's presentation back in 2020, he did mention he had many, many other values that he had tested. However, they didn't make the short list. They had to be present in nearly 100 nations to make it into this circumplex of values. It's immensely powerful research and extremely well done. So this is a real key toward the individual. How do we see the world? And I'll move to that next. What do individuals value? So much of our research here at the center and in my lab is about individuals taking a survey or individuals going into a scanner and having their brains measured in some way. And so you can use the Schwartz Value Survey for this exact purpose. We in this very room will express those 10 values that I just mentioned to varying degrees. It's almost like they're tuning that make us unique. Right? Because not all of us have the same drives towards security or self-direction. I would think we probably have some emphasis on that, but it might vary depending on the person. And so you can take this value survey, as I have done many times. I'm now going to offer you a glimpse into what my most deeply held values are. I'm very vulnerable here. So I took this survey, as I mentioned earlier this week, just to probe my 2025 values. This is what I deeply care about. And notice the 3 top values: security, and wow, am I maxed out on self-direction. So that's a conundrum I have to live with. I want to be secure, but I want to go exploring. I want to have independent ideas, and yet I'm insistent that somehow it all works out in my life and I don't fall on my face and take big risks. I'm all about benevolence as well. And I think if you take this survey, you'll notice things that resonate with how you live your life. I definitely have an independent streak. And it's maybe why you start a lab and begin investigating things. I like punk rock music. My favorite band is Bad Religion. And they did an album called Against the Grain. You know, that was one of my anthems in my head during college. And it has served me strangely at times because it's more of an exploratory style, and yet I have to balance it with wanting to secure finances and that my kids go to college and have successful lives and we have a good neighborhood set up. So notice the friction in my head as I go through my life. This isn't straightforward, right? You have to negotiate with yourself and emphasize one value here and maybe another value there, or beautifully, a combination of values. So if I use self-direction to help the people in my life, I'm using benevolence and self-direction together. That's like a superpower, and then you can really accomplish things. And you might wonder how stable values are. Do we change, or is this more like perhaps a personality variable that's very stable? The general answer is stability, but there is variation nonetheless. So if we reflect on what I did this past week when I took the survey, and then I look at what I had thought about back in 2023 when I took this survey, you notice I'm still very high on self-direction and security and benevolence. That says a lot about what I'm about. I was high on achievement here, though. I was thinking about achievement perhaps more than I was recently, and I was thinking more about conformity. But if you notice the relative positioning of the values in terms of their emphasis, it's pretty stable if you go back and forth. You're not seeing dramatic differences. Sorry, I'm moving forward. I wanted to just show you that difference. You know, the relative positioning is held, like hedonism and achievement. While they vary in their magnitude, their relative position stays the same. So I think you would observe that yourself. I am curious, like how plastic these values really are. If you're an adolescent, you're probably in self-direction and stimulation world. But if you're maybe later in life and have more to protect and more can go wrong, and maybe your health is more fragile, you might move more toward that security, tradition, conformity area of the circumplex. So I think this says a lot about our lives. And I'm reminded of COVID-19 when there were the lockdowns. We were all kind of put into this position of conformity and security, or thinking about our health, thinking about our loved ones, thinking about our lives. And we had to sacrifice a lot on self-direction. But then as society re-engaged, we could emphasize stimulation, self-direction, hedonism. It was almost like a rebound effect where maybe we were more putting ourselves out there than we would typically. So I think there's plasticity with different environmental changes and different points in life, as there would be for someone with a tribal brain that has to make it in changing conditions, whether they be weather or disease, or just a change of a hostile tribe moves into the area. We need some level of plasticity. I encourage you to take the values survey for yourself. Not right now, because that would very much compete with me talking. So definitely just check this out. It's available at idrlabs.com, or you can just search human values test in a Google search, and it pretty much comes up right away. It's a nice little tool. It takes about 5 to 10 minutes to do the survey, and you're simply agreeing or disagreeing with a variety of different position points that secretly represent the Schwartz basic human values, and you might notice that, but nonetheless, I think you can be honest with yourself and you can populate your own circumplex and get a little glimpse into what makes you tick. So I quite like this test, and I repeatedly encourage my students to take this test, and I always take it whenever I'm going to talk values with anybody. So, where do we go next? The brain. Let's actually think about the human brain. This is the brain that I mentioned of a hunter-gatherer. This is the brain of a tribal individual who makes his or her way with others around. So very much a social brain is what we're going to examine here. And we wanted to ask the question, with all this great work from people like the World Values Survey, Ronald Inglehart, and of course Shalom Schwartz with the 10 universal basic human values, how do those represent within the actual brain? And so we're going to use the technique of functional brain imaging here, where we're going to put people into an MRI scanner, and we're going to measure their blood oxygen level within the brain, which is a marker of neural activity. So we're looking at how the cortex activates in response to values-based thinking. And it's a wonderful technique for exploratory work like this, because you can get a glimpse of how these values may organize within our brains. Are they separable? Do they have things in common? Is it some mixture of both? And so this is work that I did with Adam Teed and Yelena Rakesh, former doctoral students of mine, as well as Daniel Mark. And we were investigating the self-transcendence values of universalism and benevolence in comparison to those self-enhancement values, which are power and achievement. And this was really just based on the limitations of the method. You can't study 10 values. I mean, it's a lot of mental gymnastics to try to get all the way around the circumplex. So we thought that the pivot between those values that are about enhancing your own capabilities would contrast nicely with that outward focus of the self-transcendence values. So we're limiting our investigation that I'm about to tell you about to those 4 basic human values. Now the setup for this went as follows. You would be in the scanner. You're hearing imagine the scanner noise, and you're viewing a monitor, and you're going to make little presses of agreement and disagreement using a mouse click. And we present you with an achievement activity. Attend a one-day workshop focusing on improving resume writing and interview skills. And you would just basically rate how worthwhile of an activity you think that is, or critically, how likely you'd be to participate in this. And this was an innovation that Adam Teed suggested, that we really need to ask it in different ways. It's not enough to just say, is that worthwhile? Would you actually commit your resources, your time, and your energy to this? I'm not going to do this weekend. I don't want to burn a whole day on my career stuff. That's just the phase of life I'm in. But if I were younger and really needed a job at that moment, I probably would be doing this. So participation, I think it's worthwhile, no doubt. But I would answer maybe differently for participation. And I'm just going to give a rating from a 0 to 100 with agreement here. A universalist activity would be help an organization that builds homes for low-income families in need of safe housing. These need not be your neighbors. They need not be family members. This is more oriented toward people in general, right? Universalism is about helping whole sets of people. A lot of charitable organizations are devoted to universalism, even though they might not use that term. That's really what they're about. And once again, you would rate the worthwhileness of that idea. I think that's something almost everyone can get behind, but would you actually participate? Do you have the building skills and the teamwork skills to do this one? Maybe not. So you might get different answers. And the overall setup, just to make sure it's clear, we're using the benevolence and the universalism activities, and we're going to compare them to power activities and achievement activities. So we're not just asking people, how much do you like benevolence? We're asking them in an indirect way, would they participate in helping those close to them in specific ways, or do they just think it's worthwhile? And so we'll gather those two ratings on those 4 different values. And the study actually followed this sort of procedure in which you would be prompted for worthwhileness. So we're going to have a block of trials where you just rate worthwhileness, and then you would have blocks where you rate participation. We just didn't want people to have too much acrobatics in their mind. So we would just ask one question at a time. For 7 seconds, they would read about an activity. If it was a power activity, insist that rookies carry sports equipment for you and the other experienced players on your team. Rookie hazing. This happens in the NFL, NHL, every group bonding thing there is with teams. It's about power, it's about seniority, and it's about a hierarchy. The rookies have to pay their dues. And you would rate that for 4 seconds, and you just give a 0 to 100 based on how worthwhile it is. And you would do this across these 4 different values. Now, a critical first bit of the data is looking at the behavioral ratings, and what we see in the aqua color, blue color, is the worthwhileness rating, mean rating, relative to the participation, which is in the red. And what you're seeing is a significant difference. People will rate things as worthwhile to a greater degree than they will rate that they participate. That makes some level of sense. The participation is where the rubber meets the road. That's when we really have to actually do the thing. And so we're probably a little bit more selective on how much we want to participate in something. So that was something that we had anticipated there might be a difference, and it was good to see that. When we look at the individual values themselves, achievement, power, universalism, and benevolence across, again, the red bars would be for the participation and the bluish bars for the worthwhileness. You're seeing relative preservation, so it's not like we choose to participate in things that we utterly didn't think were worthwhile, or vice versa. The relative positioning of these bars is the same. It's just that it's amplified a bit more with the worthwhileness rating. So there's an important difference there. And indeed, our participants do vary a lot. These are data from a select group of individuals. If we had a larger sample or a different sample, we might have seen different expression of these 4 values. Our group just happened to be lower on power and highest on achievement and benevolence. Those need not be the case across individuals, but that was the group that we were studying. And this was published in Social Neuroscience in 2019. Let's talk about the brain. This is the brain with the participation ratings, thinking versus doing. That key question of, would you actually participate, or do you merely think this is worthwhile? And when we would go to the extra mileage of participating, you see this region, a cluster of cortical activity that's at the junction of the parietal lobe, the temporal lobe, occupies area of the superior temporal gyrus and middle temporal gyrus. That's known as the right temporoparietal junction, or right TPJ in the language of neuroimaging. That's an area that's very much involved in perspective taking. When I think about what audience members are imagining right now, when you're thinking about, where am I going with this talk? When is this guy going to start showing more brain images? That's theory of mind. That's perspective taking. That's often associated with this area, and it is hemispherically typically on the right side. So this is a very social brain area that's active for participation. That makes a lot of sense. When we participate, when we're forcing the rookies to carry the equipment, if that's something we buy into, we're telling them something. It's about other people. We know that they're going to think a certain thing. We think it's going to help our team bonding into the future. Very much a social value. So right away, when we start to look at values in the brain, social behavior comes to the foreground. This is a result that I really like. So this is one of those validation moments. So Schwartz and his colleagues did surveys in 90+ countries around the world, finding that those self-transcendence values are different than the self-enhancement values. Here is the brain equivalent of that comparison. When we look at what's active for the self-transcendence, universalism and benevolence, relative to power and achievement, we get this cluster of activation in the medial prefrontal cortex. So this is an area that's often associated with many human behaviors. Firstly, value. So when you have someone working for money or primary rewards in a scanner or social rewards, this area is active. And it's also involved in reflection about oneself in relation to other people. It's one of those regions that's like the right TPJ, famously a social networked area of our brains. So that is what's active when we pivot to thinking about other people and involve others in our decision making. This is a great result. I mean, I'm really thrilled this worked out this way because it didn't have to, right? These values could fall apart at the level of the neural circuitry and they only express maybe in groups in large ways. No, we see resonance at the level of neurons all the way up to societal preferences. So very, very interesting finding. And then we wanted to ask, how do the four values separate? Are there specific regions for power and for achievement and so on? What comes out of that analysis is actually a story of some values express the same, or at least similarly in the brain. This is common activity for power, benevolence, and universalism relative to achievement. So achievement stands out as the oddball here. Our sample was into achievement as they rated, but it's just, when it comes to the brain, you're seeing a lot of that prefrontal cortex, the medial prefrontal cortex on the right, and temporal cortex again on the right side, right temporal parietal junction. So this is kind of a neural network for many values, and I would say that this wasn't expected. You know, we didn't think we would get this result, but since we did, you begin to think, well, why would that be? I would say that what's common to power, benevolence, and universalism is that they involve other people. As much as power is a self-enhancement value, power only means anything in relation to other individuals, or at least in a group hierarchy, it's a very significant part of what we think power would be. So again, social brain regions become active in association with all three of those in relation to achievement. That's a discontinuity from the survey research. So you learn new things in science with different methods sometimes. Let's pivot to the modulation. So we know that the values are pretty stable, but we saw even in my values expression that they do change over time. The brain is about adaptation and plasticity. What worked yesterday may not work tomorrow. How does the brain actually modulate values? And so we wanted to investigate this question. This is work of Adam Teed on his dissertation. And the hormones oxytocin and vasopressin come up very quickly when you think about hormones. These are social hormones that affect our group behavior. You may have heard of oxytocin as a trust-building hormone, pair bonding. It's active in upping the salience of social cues. And vasopressin is specifically active in group aggression, as well as pair bonding, as well as things like communication. So these are generally involved when we get into group situations. And the reason I have that little nasal spray is you can actually elevate these hormone levels with synthetic hormones. So what we did here is bring people into the lab, same participants who were in the brain imaging study. They would inhale synthetic oxytocin, a placebo or synthetic vasopressin. They were blind to the condition, as were we. It's double-blinded situation, and we wanted to know, would vasopressin or oxytocin or both impact the expression of these values? So it's a really kind of bizarre idea. Like, you're actually have this higher oxytocin level, not because you were, bonding with your children, which also elevates it. It's hard to experimentally control bonding with children, but you can have people upregulate oxytocin or vasopressin in the lab. If you inhale this hormone, about 30 minutes later, it's going to have a peak impact within your brain. Doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier, so it stays up there and can impact our behavior. And so what we found was that people under the influence of elevated vasopressin did show a greater agreement with universalism activities relative to placebo. So this is all blind and controlled. And what I had actually recalled us predicting was that benevolence would be enhanced by oxytocin. That would have been the obvious prediction. Didn't obtain that. Oxytocin didn't affect the values in any significant way, but vasopressin did, which is just new learning. And it shows that there is plasticity, even at that level of how we think about societal values when we go to the individual molecular brain-based level. So it's exciting work to reflect back on this, and this is some years back, but it's stayed with me. This is an important topic. So I'm going to go ahead and summarize what we've talked about and talk about some conclusions and applications that we can think about. Firstly, I discussed cultural values. They tend to emphasize either survival or self-expression, and cultures also organize around how traditional they are or how secular they are. And those are independent dimensions, so you can have a very traditional culture that's also into self-direction, and you can have a very survival-based culture that's also secular, and we see that around the world. And there is cultural variation over time, as we saw from that movie clip from the World Values Survey, but moderately. We don't see cultures radically shifting their ways in small numbers of years, and this is a story of generations as well. So those that took the survey back in 1981 are not the same people that took the survey in 2010. So if you want to know where a culture's headed, look to the young people, because they will ultimately be the individuals expressing these values over time. We talked about the personal values with the great work of Shalom Schwartz and his colleagues. People vary in how they express each of those 10 values. They're like settings on a dial that say something about us. And these personal values are relatively stable, but there is flexibility, at least moderately. And I think that's correct. I think if you take that survey, you'll find that you do resonate with certain values more than others. We talked about values and how they're implemented in the brain, and that personal values tend to be distributed. So we didn't see one value, one cortical network, or one cortical region. Rather, we saw areas that are socially engaged, and many tasks do engage when we see the cortical organization for participation in values or in some type of specific social context. Oddly enough, power, universalism, and benevolence do group together at the level of the brain. And there is plasticity, as we talked about with the hormone vasopressin. I would say in naturalistic conditions, there also is plasticity, just depending on how we respond to the environment. And taking us full circle, we are tribal beings. We are all about the people around us, and we do sometimes have to act in accordance with our own interests. We also may want to pivot and consider others and what they are doing in relation to us. And I think that says a lot about human life. And I wanted to spend a bit of time about future questions. This is really amazing work that's gone on for decades, but of course more work needs to be done. I'm very curious about how stable our values are over the lifespan. So not simply from maybe 5 years ago to now or 3 years ago, but what about when you're a young adult versus a middle-aged person versus an older adult? How do the values actually operate? And critically, how do they impact our health? I think one hypothesis that I like to think about is that maybe that benevolence activity that I enjoy anyway is good for me, right? It reduces my stress when I help a neighbor or help a friend or help one of my kids. It certainly seems to reduce my stress, and I think that's a good feature for a life long term. And then critically, how do the values profiles link up to other measures of social connectedness? And this is where the BrainHealth Project can really help us, because there's lots and lots of data across many, many individuals, again, with a global view. And we'd like to plug in a basic values survey into that so that we can start to address some of these questions and really work toward how can we shape our health and our well-being and our flourishing around using these values? I like to think of the Schwartz circumplex as a compass. We can aim for self-transcendence. We can consciously do good for others. Or perhaps if another pandemic is hitting, we want to get into the security business and think about conservation, and we have to pivot what direction we're moving in our lives. And this is that aspirational or pursuit component of the values. We can aim for one or more directions, and it can be a guide for our behavior. I also have depicted the Rosetta Stone. Translating among languages is important here. Any Star Trek fans out there? Why can aliens understand one another in Star Trek? Does anyone know? Yes, the universal translator, yes. So the reason we can understand all the aliens is because they have a universal translator. Once again, thank you to Shalom Schwartz and his colleagues for providing that. If I want to understand what makes you tick, and you express certain values that maybe I resonate with, we can bond over these possibilities, and there's 10 of them. If it's not working on security and we're at loggerheads, pivot to self-direction, or how do you think about achievement? This is a conversational tool if we avail ourselves of that. And I think this is actually where we do go from here. So I would suggest we learn this vocabulary. It took me some years, I will confess. Some of Schwartz and colleagues' ideas like universalism don't stick out in your mind right away, but it really is worth thinking these through. And once you understand this, you have this capacity to live in accordance with those values that you express the strongest and also bond with other people around those. You can then take time to reflect on those values, perhaps that you express the least. I'm not that into power. It always comes out lower on my circumplex. And I think that's correct. I'm not about trying to control others, and I'm not about hoarding resources at all. It's just not the way I tick. Perhaps I should change my ways, though, right? There might be circumstances where I would need to exert more of a power influence or understand someone that has more of a power orientation. And when in doubt, I think it's helpful to talk to others about their perspectives on life, and it's all about values. So I wanted to just go full circle and come back to the 3 values you might have mentioned. Where's universalism? Where's benevolence? Where's something called hedonism? They're different labels, but I think we do find them here. So when I think of compassion, that's very much about benevolence. It might even be universalism. Where is integrity, respect, and honesty? And I think that there's an answer here, and it has to do with getting out of man-made environments and electronic environments. Put your phone on the charger, close your laptop, go take a walk out in nature, and rediscover where some of these things lie. So it doesn't make sense that honesty would be a universal human value, because we have to lie sometimes, right? If some massive weather event happens and we only have enough food for myself and my child, I don't want to go honestly telling everyone that I have the food, right? That's going to be very counterproductive in those circumstances. And some cultures do have much more pressure on them. They don't have the luxury of full transparency all the time. However, honesty does reside in the values in terms of what we pursue, what we choose to pursue. And I think when you really live your values authentically, when I'm in the business of self-direction, and I'm also thinking about helping others, towards security. I'm living my values. I'm being honest with myself. And I can be honest with others about that as well. And it's an immensely powerful bonding tool if we do that kind of thing. And I had also asked, that big question of like, what's your purpose? And I think it's taking this walk with other individuals and being reliable, investing in reputation and having integrity. It's about playing a long game and having a good reputation and building that reputation. Very relevant to our corporate world as well. If you want to destroy your brand, start acting strangely. I'm not thinking of any one particular person or two, but you want to maintain your position in the community and do good by others. And I think that's ultimately leading the good life when we do that. So thank you very much for your attention and your time. And just before we get to questions, I do want to really thank Adam Teed, Yelena Rakich, Daniel Mark, and Michael Lundy, who are my colleagues on this. And a huge thanks to the World Values Survey, and a giant thanks to Shalom Schwartz on his career. Hello, Shalom, once again, and thank you for watching this talk. It's a real highlight. And with that, I'm always interested in continuing the conversation on values. So I'm happy to entertain questions or hear about your thoughts.
Okay, questions. First one I see over here.
Okay, really great presentation. So what I'm wondering is, one of the things that we do now organizationally is we talk about having values, organizational values. And those are usually developed by your executive leadership team. And we talk about making sure that those values are shared by all your organization. And it's really foundational. It directs the strategy. It directs decision making. But what would your advice be, for organizations that are really looking to develop those values? How do you do that to make sure that they are being able to be translated to your employees and to all the rest of your stakeholders?
Thank you for the question. It's an excellent point. When businesses operate or any organization operates, they want to aim their compass toward profitability, but also being a good community member and investing in a good reputation. So once again, I think just like an individual should live their personal values, understand what they're about, embrace those directions, and think of ways that they can do that, I think an organization can do the same sort of thing. There's actually some work that tries to translate the basic human values into more corporate values, and I'll send you some of that if you're interested. And often, that corporate work essentially boils down to the same 10 basic human values. The labels are a little bit different, and you might have to massage the language a little bit because some of those do represent different things depending on the context. But it's all about matching the context that you're working in and what your goals are to those values. And so I think the magic is when you can find corporate values that actually get you where you need to be with both profitability and being a good community partner and establishing a reputation. And it's different for everybody in different business landscapes. But if you do that, then it's easier to translate, I think, to everyone in the organization. If you can explain this clearly, and again, it's about vocabulary building. I wasn't trained in values psychology, and I'm sure many of us weren't. It often escapes the curriculum because it's in social psychology, but it's kind of sociology, and it's kind of demography and anthropology and biology all mixed together. So I think understanding the vocabulary and being specific about how we go forward, and if you find resonance with any of the basic human values, you're probably onto something because it's been validated in 90 plus cultures already. So it's a wonderful thing that we can piggyback off of that. And I think we do find similarities at an organizational level and at a personal level.
Hey, Dan, we have a online question I want to make sure and get to. What does the research say about the impact of world events on changes, sometimes sudden changes in world events that may serve as a catalyst to changes in these dimensions that you've been discussing?
Yes, that's a great question. I have mentioned the environment is going to impact values as well as the social dynamics. And so I think much like in evolution where we have this concept of punctuated equilibrium where a species will go for a very long time, then a weather event hits and theropod dinosaurs no longer work, and so there's a change. I think we'd see something similarly in cultures where what has worked previously, especially in traditional or conformist values, doesn't work now, and so you need to pivot toward openness to change. But the younger generation is, again, the leading edge of this. If you want to know where a culture's headed, talk to the young people, and better yet, invest in the young people and try to help them along the way so that we don't lose sight of all the wisdom of the ages, but we also adapt to new and changing conditions.
I think we can take time for one more quick question. Yep.
Your work and the tools that you use in doing this research, I'm interested in using these tools as far as to document the effectiveness of a certain therapeutic modality, like in treating substance use disorder or criminal behavior, recidivism, and that openness to change. The objective is to have a therapeutic modality to help transformative change in criminal behavior and drug abuse behavior.
It's a great question. So our placement within society. Yes, so if there's some sort of a therapeutic intervention, especially changing lifestyle, like something like substance abuse or coming out of incarceration, that is going to be one of those dramatic shifts. And the hopeful idea is that personal growth comes out of this sort of situation, that someone has learned from past mistakes and maybe can pivot now. I would think this technique would work well at the survey level of just giving people the opportunity to express values and maybe even tuning one of these surveys toward a therapeutic intervention. One would imagine that you would see openness to change be embraced, that someone is now going to reshape their life. And I think we do that. We do that, again, just in relation to that online question. There are moments where circumstances are different. It demands personal growth. And I think that the values are, again, informative. They're not the whole answer, but I think they give us some universal answers, just like the universal translator does, that we can kind of get on board with that and expect to see similar things across similar people. And I do think that values do impact our health every day. So live your values. And if you want to talk values at any point, I'm easy to find and always excitable on this topic. So thank you so much. And
Thank
have
you,
a great
Dan.
rest of your day.
Lifelong brain health, this is our shared mission. And we want to highlight some upcoming events. We hope you'll join us on April 11th. Dr. Ted Price will discuss work in the Center for Advanced Pain Studies at UTD focused on developing non-opioid pain therapeutics. And we have a QR code, should be up here, for taking a new sleep text challenge. So take the sleep text challenge if you scan this QR code. Thank you.